Part two, principles of operant conditioning. So what we're going to talk about today is like how this stuff all works. So last week we talked about review slide. We talked about how behavior analysis is a science of human behavior, and up until B.F. Skinner in like the 1930s and 40s, human behavior was outside of the realm of science because of the internal experience, the mind, the soul, the sacred of the internal human experience. Nobody could understand it. How could we possibly have a scientific explanation of it? And what Skinner did is he started very methodically. Let's find out what we can know. Let's start from the bottom up and build a science based upon some fundamental understandings. So he started out trying to describe the relationship between an organism and its environment. That's it. How do they interact? We have an organism. It has a biological makeup. It has a history of learning. And it has an environment in which it's living. So how does that history of reinforcement, history of learning, and its genetic endowment, how does that govern its interactions with the environment? We can know about the environment. And how can we learn about the organism from that? How it behaves, how it learns, how it adapts. And the main sort of finding, the main sort of the active part, the mechanism by which this science works, is this idea of selection by consequences. Right? So I select my behavior based upon its consequences. I don't speed in my car because the consequences are getting a ticket. Or more likely, I don't speed when I see a police officer because I'll get a ticket. And I probably do speed when I'm late for work because the consequence of arriving to work a little bit closer to on time can outweigh the possible consequence of getting a ticket. Things like that. You know about that, don't you? All right. So what we're going to start into today, and I know for some of you who are at training week, this is very similar. But Skinner talked about what he called the three-term contingency. And if you notice, if you take this is stimulus response. This is Watsonian classical conditioning. If you have a stimulus that impinges upon the organism behaves in a certain way. There's a reflex, a reaction. But what Skinner's saying is in operant conditioning, which is not opposed to, but a different type of learning from respondent or classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, I learned that a stimulus elicits a response. We talk about eliciting. So a stimulus, a bonk on the knee, elicits a knee-jerk sort of reaction. Right? But in operant conditioning, it's the consequence that's controlling behavior. So you guys have heard at this point, because you've been working at Keystone for a bit, but we talk about ABC data a lot. And ABC stands for antecedent behavior and consequence. Right? So this is really what's going on in most learning situations, is that there's an antecedent. Antecedent comes before. It's a stimulus that precedes the behavior. It's a signal that a certain relationship between a behavior and its consequence exists in the environment. If there's a red light at an intersection, it's signaling to me that the behavior of driving through the intersection is likely to be, the consequence of that behavior is likely to be getting hit by a car. It's dangerous. It's likely to be punished. If the light's green, it's a signal that driving through the intersection is likely to be reinforced by getting to the other side of the intersection. Right, so the traffic signal is a very classic example of an antecedent stimulus. A stimulus that precedes a behavior that signals whether a certain reinforcement or punishment contingency is in place. There's different types of antecedent stimulus. We can get into that. I know Matt was talking about it in his class yesterday. What I just want to have is a basic understanding that there are antecedent stimuli. In Skinner's classic three-term contingency, you have this SD. S is for stimulus, and the D is for discriminative. So it's a discriminative stimulus. It allows you to discriminate between one contingency and another. A signal that allows you to know that drinking a a beer in one situation is likely to be reinforced. Drinking a beer in another situation, like right now, the beer in my coffee cup, is likely to be punished.
Good thing no one's here.
Okay, next term. The R in Skinner's three-term contingency is for response, whereas in the ABC it's for behavior. Same thing. This is the behavior. We talked last week about how behavior is anything that an organism does, anything at all. It can be observable or unobservable. And last is the SR. So stimulus, the R is for reinforcing. But that's just one small part. It doesn't have to be a reinforcing stimulus. It's just sort of how Skinner wrote his three-term contingency. But we use in ABC, the C is for consequence. I like that a little bit more, because a consequence is just a stimulus that follows behavior that can either increase or decrease the likelihood that that behavior will occur in the future. Make sense? Good. All right, let's talk about consequences. Consequences, a lot. Consequences are cool. Consequences are what we control, what we govern in our environment of Keystone, what we govern in our therapy situations, right? In behavior analysis, we define consequences functionally. What's the function of a consequence, right? Because a certain consequence can follow behavior, and it can function differently for different people. Is sending one child to the principal's office can decrease behavior, it can be punishing. Another kid, you can send them to the principal's office, you'll be like, woo, I'm out of class, I'm going to walk through the halls, I'm going to look at that class, I'm going to look at that class, then I'm going to go and talk to the principal. What? Right, so the function of that consequence is different depending on the person. Right, so when we define consequences in this science, we have to define it functionally because it's the only way it can be consistent. So, reinforcement. A reinforcement is when a behavior is followed by a reinforcing consequence, that behavior has a higher probability of being emitted in similar situations in the future. By similar situations, I'm talking about antecedent stimuli. Right, so if I'm in a classroom, here's a perfect example. I like to tell jokes, right? Now I've learned that if I'm standing in front of Marlena and I tell any joke in the world, she's going to laugh. So she's an antecedent stimulus that pretty much, even my low-end jokes are going to be laughed at, reinforced with positive attention. That's what I crave. However, Julie is a different antecedent stimulus. She has a completely different sense of humor. And so the same joke in a different situation, a different environment with a different antecedent stimulus is going to have a different consequence. Right? And I've learned that, I've learned Julie's sense of humor now. I hope she watches this. But I've learned it to the point where I've gotten reinforced a couple of times, and that style of joke, sort of dry, witty humor, has begun to increase in probability. But only in that situation. When I'm in front of Julie, my dry, witty jokes have increased in probability. When I'm in front of anybody else, not really, because they're kind of groaners and they're not that funny. Especially in front of Kirsten, who doesn't laugh at any of my jokes anymore. So you can see how these different antecedent stimuli, the relationship between the behavior and the consequence still depends upon the environment. Right? These antecedent stimuli signal when a contingency between behavior and its consequences is in place. The same thing as if you've got a really strict teacher in school and you would never act up in class. Right? Because any behavior, getting out of your seat, it's going to be punished. Get back in your seat. What happens when the substitute comes in?
Go nuts.
You go nuts. The rules have changed. The antecedent stimuli have changed, so the contingencies between behavior and consequences have changed. Right? So, this functional part of this definition is that when a behavior is followed by any stimulus that increases the probability of that behavior being emitted in similar situations, that stimulus is considered a reinforcer. Sending a child to the principal's office. If they jump out of their seat and go wooga booga 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 booga, and you send them to the principal's office, and they come back and they wooga booga booga some more, and the probability of wooga boogieing increases, you've reinforced that child by sending them to the principal's office. Sending them to the principal's office is a reinforcer for that behavior, right? It's the function that matters. Punishment's the same thing. Any behavior followed by a punishing consequence will then have a lower probability of being emitted in similar situations in the future. Well, I punished my kid. I used punishment, I sent him to the principal's office, and it didn't work. Punishment doesn't work. Well, it wasn't a punisher if it didn't work. That's how these things work, that's how these functional definitions work, and it's the beauty in clear-cuttedness. That's probably not a word, but I don't care, it works. The clear-cuttedness of behavior analysis is these functional definitions. I tried to use positive reinforcement, but it doesn't work. Well, it wasn't positive reinforcement if it didn't work. Questions on this? Functional definitions. This is pretty easy, right? This is basic. This is 101. Okay. Here's the big misunderstanding. This is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of psychology. The consequence of behavior can involve the addition of a stimulus to the environment or the withdrawal of a stimulus from the environment. I can add something to your environment or I can take something away. So when I talk about positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, I'm talking about